Nice. Who's going to Hawaii? Is Andy going to Hawaii?
I wish.
I'm going to Cali.
I'm going to Spokane. That's as far as I got.
Nice. Nice.
Find my fridge.
What do you guys want to do for spring break?
What?
Repeat that.
I'm going to
gonna do?
participate in some extra activities.
You're frozen.
Okay.
I'm going to my fridge.
You're going where?
Fridge.
It's not a place. It's a.
There we go.
I'm going to the Tacoma Convention Center for Sports Medicine State.
Yeah, and that.
Nice.
I gotta.
Thanks.
What are you doing, Charlie Brown?
Obviously,
I am going to be right here in the legislature making sure that real ID bill that you guys are tracking passes and becomes law. How does that sound? I'm not going anywhere. I'm stuck here in Olympia.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Andy, do you want to talk about where we are on the real ID bill? How do you want to handle this? Where do you want to go?
I mean, I think that it would be worth it for these guys just as a little update of where the bill is at and maybe what's going to happen while we're over at spring break. But I was talking to them. We just finished a Socratic seminar on what should we do, the United States should do about the Syrian crisis, or the Syrian refugee crisis, since that's I mean, right now we're in a contemporary world problems class, and so that's I would say a global crisis. And so for the last connection earlier today, we talked a little bit about real ID, but I mean, a lot of the discussion was about more like international politics. And so I think we could do a little bit of both if that works with you.
Sounds good to me. Okay. So
right.
the real ID bill has passed out of the House Transportation Committee now. So it started out as a Senate bill, right? Got through the Senate Transportation, passed off the Senate floor, got over to the House. It got caught up in a little bit of the politics surrounding immigration, quite frankly. And in the House Transportation Committee, it was an interesting vote because the people who were supporting the bill were like the airports, the SeaTac Airport and the Spokane Airport, as well as some business interests who want to make sure that people and goods can travel, freely around the United States in compliance with federal law. And the opponents ended up being the labor advocates and the social justice advocates, all of whom are concerned that this real ID ends up being some kind of a document that shows whether or not you are a legal immigrant or not. And the immigration issue, of course, is pretty sensitive subject right now because of the Trump administration's executive orders saying that they don't want illegal immigrants to be traveling into the United States anymore. And I quite frankly think that if some of his folks had their way, they would try and deport a number of those illegal immigrants. And I think that's where the social justice folks were coming from, as well as the ACLU, in the sense that they believe that this ID ends up being a de facto statement as to whether you're a legal immigrant here in the United States or not. And particularly in Washington, we are a very much more progressive and open state, and your legal immigration status is less of an issue in the Puget Sound area. It's certainly an issue over in Eastern Washington, but interestingly, the Eastern Washington folks tend to want those immigrants to be here in Washington because they provide a very significant amount of the labor for the farms that are over in Eastern Washington. So I don't think that the Eastern Washington folks are anti-immigrant by any means, nor are they anti-illegal immigrant by any means. they're very sensitive to the fact that these people are coming over. They tend to be some of the best workers that they have, and want to hire them and pay them for that work. So interestingly, the business community was supporting the bill, but the bill, as it moved out of the House Transportation Committee, was only supported by the Democrats, which isn't often the case. The Democrats tend to side with the labor and the social justice folks on most issues, and the Republicans wouldn't. In this case, the Republicans voted against the bill. And I think that the reason why the Republicans ended up voting against the bill in the House, and I'm only saying this from my perspective, I'm not certain that this is the case because I haven't spoken to any of them on the issue. I believe that they are probably arguing that the Real ID bill, because it that new identification would cost more money than a regular license, they were arguing that people shouldn't have to pay more just to get what is otherwise a driver's license. But it does cost the Department of Licensing more money to process these, because they have to have two people look at the ID as per federal law. And it costs more money in terms of man hours for the Department of Licensing. So I think the Republicans kind of used it as a way to pretend, well, I shouldn't say that, as a way to indicate their dissatisfaction with the bill, which was consistent with the opponents of the bill, but for much different reasons than what the opponents of the bill were arguing when they were in front of that committee. The Democrats, on the other hand, understand, and the Republicans do too, but there's some grandstanding that happens in the legislature oftentimes. The Democrats know that this has to get done, otherwise it's going to be very disruptive at our airports here in the state of Washington, and for any Washingtonian who's traveling. Let's say you fly to Atlanta and you have to get a connecting flight from Atlanta onto Washington, D.C. or something like that. You are going to be kind of caught up in this whole morass of federal law and state law not working together. And so the majority party in the House, at least, realizes they had to take this vote to pass this in order to allow for the ease of movement of our citizens from Washington State around the United States. So it passed out on party line vote. It was recently, so when it goes out of the House Transportation Committee, it goes to a committee called Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is really, I think I've described this to you as a place where all the bills go, and then they kind of get lined up and get ready to go to the floor. And it just recently got pulled out of the Rules Committee. I believe it was yesterday, and it is pending now before the full House for action. And it's my expectation that that bill will pass on the floor of the House before next Tuesday, the end of next Tuesday, 5 o'clock, I believe it is, when all bills from the opposite House have to pass off the floor of the opposite side. So Senate bills have to be out of the House, and House bills have to be out of the Senate by Tuesday of next week. So while you're all on vacation, we will be down here trying to make sure that bills that we want to get before the governor get passed. And so that's where things stand on that issue for right now. Who's got questions? Did somebody ask what's going to happen on the floor?
I think so.
That's what I thought. There you go. When it gets to the floor of the House, there's going to be a lot of debate about the cost. I think that Republicans are going to bring up the cost of the license on the floor. There's also going to be a debate about whether this is a whether the state is actually kowtowing to the federal government on your status as a citizen of the United States. And so there will be some of those votes going on and discussion going on. And quite frankly, I think that it's going to be about a 51, 52 for the bill vote coming out of the House, with about 48 against. And it might end up being kind of a mix of Republicans and Democrats voting different ways. I think that some of the Republicans are going to vote for the bill, even though the committee Republicans voted against the bill. I think on the floor you'll have some Republicans voting for the bill to get it out, and you'll have some of the Democrats, the more progressive Democrats who are concerned about the immigration policies of the United States, voting against the bill, primarily as a way to kind of show their distaste for the president's immigration stance on issues. So although this bill is vitally important to the citizens of the state, so for the free travel and movement, if you're going to travel by air in this state, despite the fact that this has to get done, it is by no means assured that it will pass in the House. And so it could be kind of interesting. We may end up, if they vote it down, we may end up in a odd situation of being probably the only state that doesn't have compliance with the Real ID requirements of the federal government and Homeland Security, and it could be fairly disruptive. So if it doesn't pass in the next couple of days, my sense is that the legislature will say, wait, hold on, this is too important. We're going to hold this bill and still take action on it, even beyond that cutoff date of next Tuesday. So we might see it go all the way to April 23rd when this regular session of the legislature concludes, or even into the extra sessions that most everybody expects we're going to have because of the budget debates that are going on, which of course surround school funding, which all of you we've discussed in the past. So it's going to be kind of a interesting time if that bill does not pass. And again, as I described in one of our earlier sessions, it is a good lesson on how federal law intersects with state law. And even though that federal law passed some probably 10 years ago, because it was in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that this law passed, now that you've got a new administration, you've got 10 years, or I guess it's almost 17 years now since 9/11, the politics are kind of changing, and now you get this immigrant thing, and it really throws off some of the, or it changes the debate or the discussion around this thing. So, I mean, think about where you were 17 years ago, right? Most of you were probably just infants at the time of 9/11. So the world has changed dramatically, I think, in the last 17 years. It's certainly a lot different than the world I knew before 9/11. And one thing is for certain in American politics, that nothing stays the same. And where people were pretty concerned about making sure that we knew everybody who was traveling through our airports as of after 9/11, because they were airplanes that were used as bombs to take down the World Trade Center and attack the Pentagon. Nowadays, I guess we're kind of looking at a situation where people are upset because just because you traveled here from Mexico or part of Central America, or from Syria or other parts of the world, you're seeking a better life, and this document is now almost kind of looked at as a scarlet letter, if you know what I mean by that reference. The the book, The Scarlet Letter, people having this ID are going to be branded either as legally here in the United States or illegally in the United States. And I think that's a very valid concern by the social justice folks, that people might be otherwise branded as being legal or illegal just by the fact that they do or don't have real ID. And not everybody's going to go get that real ID. Let's be honest about it. I mean, it's more expensive. So if you choose to just get a driver's license because you don't fly very often, why should this document create a misperception about the validity of my citizenship in the United States? My son and both daughters don't have real ID, but they certainly are U.S. citizens. If I happen to have children who were of a different skin color and I didn't have the real ID, I might be looked at a little bit sideways, you know, particularly if you are of a Mexican heritage or you're of a Middle Eastern descent. You're gonna there's gonna be a perception from some people based on whether you've got real ID or not, and that's just not. It's not okay. Number one, as a society, that's not who we are as an American society. But the fact is that we have the intersection of nationalist politics that seem to have taken hold in our national debate up against the very valid concern of safety and security of the United States, because we've been attacked and we're going to be attacked, and we want to make sure that we're not attacked by somebody who might be an ISIS type sympathizer or whatever other group just decides they don't like the United States. So go ahead.
How credible would this bill be? Because a federal police officer can just shrug it off and just enforce federal law. Because I mean, yeah, it wouldn't exactly be I don't know, it's just awkward because the federal police can just shrug it off and do whatever in our state.
Is that the FBI?
Sure.
Yeah.
Probably.
I think that there's a perception that that might happen. I don't think that that is likely to happen in the majority of cases. However, there have been some news reports recently where a police officer stopped somebody on the roadway for one reason or another. They did not have valid ID. Whether it was real ID or not, they didn't have valid ID. So they called it in to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement people. That person was taken to the detention center that's located in the Tide Flats down at the port of Tacoma. And it took about a week or two before they were released. They actually did have valid papers to be here in the United States, a green card. But the very fact that that person was driving and got stopped, and because they didn't have the valid ID, in most cases, a middle-aged white man like me probably would not have been arrested and detained in jail for a week, right? In this circumstance, you had probably a younger person of color or a person of maybe some of the facial features, distinctive facial features that are prominent in the Middle East, and didn't have the proper ID. And so they called it into ICE, and ICE said, hey, we're going to take this guy. You know, I think that your generation, in my opinion, is going to have to stand up and say either this is okay or this is not okay. And I have a feeling if you're anything like my children, who are just maybe 5 to 7 years older than you are, you're much more tolerant of all of your peers. You don't carry some of the prejudices or fears, I would say, of folks who might come from different nations. And I think that it's just incredibly important that you all stand up and say, yes, this is okay, or no, it isn't okay to be acting in these ways. And I hope that what's going on here in America right now, and classes like Andy's and others that you take will make you realize that it is important to register to vote, to actually vote, to participate in our democracy, because this is your democracy, this is your country, this is your society that you're choosing to live in. And in a very real way, when you stand up and you say, this is what I want, those things over time eventually happen. If you don't stand up, if you sit by and let things happen that you don't like, you're by doing that, your silence is acquiescence to what's happening. And I think that it's this type of a situation in the course of history comes around about every 50 years, give or take. And at some point, when we've made progress, people sometimes become complacent, and then we tend to take some steps backward. And unless people stand up and say, this is where I want to be, and this is how I want my society to be, then you're going to let other people dictate what that society is going to be that you are going to live in. So it can happen. As to your question, back to the underlying question, if they don't have the real ID and they get stopped, we've seen a couple of instances of it. It's not super prevalent, but it can, and unfortunately, probably will continue to happen for a period of time here in the United States.
I think it's a good segue to what we talked about yesterday with the Syrian refugees. I mean, part of why we do Socratic seminars, I think in my class, is so that we get to hear what everybody thinks and they get a chance to discuss it. And so the prompt that they were faced with yesterday was, what should the United States do in response? Or they could say, was what we've done so far either effective or appropriate? So they had a couple options. We had a pretty good discussion, but I know that about half of these students were gone for various reasons, whether sports or track, baseball, those kinds of things. So now I think, we have about a little less than 10 minutes, I think. What do you guys want to ask some questions, with Charlie, or just talk about it, or see what he thinks on the issue? I don't know. What do you guys want to do?
Can you enlighten us on yesterday's bombings in Syria? Wait, did we already ask that question?
Kind of.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that if people want to hear it.
Definitely.
So and then that all plays into the Syria question, the refugees from Syria. The people are fleeing Syria because there's a civil war going on there, right? And the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is trying to assert his dominance over parts of that country and absolute control for what I believe are nefarious reasons. And he's claiming that he's trying to get rid of ISIS, but quite honestly, that the actions that he's taken over the last 5 to 7 years don't necessarily square with just trying to get rid of ISIS. He wants absolute control, and there were citizens who were rising up against his authoritarian rule. So you've got people fleeing Syria because of the authoritarianism and the brutal manner in which Bashar al-Assad is trying to assert his control over the people. And so when Syria launched that attack on the cities. It wasn't Aleppo, it was some other city in Syria, and used chemical weapons. And it's very clear, at least from the United Nations and world entities, that he used chemical weapons on civilians just indiscriminately. And apparently it was a chlorine gas of some sort, so it just kills anybody who breathes it in, because that's how chemical weapons work. The United States response was, you know, we have seen Bashar al-Assad do this in the past. And in the previous presidency, President Obama had said, you know, there's a red line here that you can't cross. You can't use chemical weapons on your people. Bashar al-Assad called the president's bluff on this, essentially, and said, oh, what are you going to do? So he goes and uses chemical weapons. And the United States, during that Obama administration, did not retaliate in a manner which Obama had said that they would. So when Bashar al-Assad did that again yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I think that what the thinking in Washington, D.C. was that Bashar al-Assad is provoking us again. Are we going to, is this new Trump administration going to react in the same way that the Obama administration had reacted? And I think that the calculation was that we cannot sit by and let that happen again, because then we're just showing that we really aren't going to take any action, and then that guy's just going to go and wipe out thousands and thousands of civilians in his quest for absolute dominance and authoritarian control, much like Adolf Hitler did during the 1940s and during World War II. I believe that what the president did was to show that we are not the Obama administration. We are going to take action. And they sent 57, I believe it was 57, it might have been 59 cruise missiles in and wiped out that whole air base. And so I think that the reason why they did that is to show that Assad, I'm not going to sit back and let you do this. Interestingly, that attack on Syria is also viewed by Russia as an attack on a ally of Russia. And so now the question is going to be, what is the relationship between the Trump administration and Donald Trump and some of his people and Russia? What's Russia going to do? And given what we know about some of the communications between the Trump administration during the elections and Russia's attempt to influence the outcome of the election, that decision by President Trump to attack Syria may escalate into something a heck of a lot more serious than what we see today. If Russia says, hey, you attacked our people, we're going to go in and attack other areas in Syria that maybe some of your allies are working on, it's kind of a proxy war that's going on, and it's gravely unfortunate. The Middle East right now is being used as a proxy war between superpowers, and that is the United States, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. And we can't do anything about it individually, but what we can do is to stand up and say that it is wrong for Bashar al-Assad to do this kind of a thing. We do have to react, but we also have to stand up and say, we want our elected officials, whether it's locally, statewide, or nationally, to live by the norms of a free society, and in a way, I think it's going to force Congress to really look more closely at what the ties between the Trump administration and the campaign was between Russia. And I think that we might see where this Trump administration realizes, you know what, those guys, Putin, President Putin of Russia, really is not a good guy, and he's not somebody we can be trusted. Unfortunately, I think it might escalate into something a lot worse than it is today. And I hope and pray that it doesn't, but it could. So kind of a long-winded answer to that attack yesterday. Bashar al-Assad's provocation and the attack yesterday may have a long-term consequence. That's a lot broader than just what we're reading in the paper right now. It's a very good question. That's a really good question. And so that goes back to the question that Andy posed. What then do we do about these refugees? If it were me, I'd say, I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to bring them home. I'm going to get them to a safe haven of some sort. And whether it's the United States or whether it's Canada or whether it's France or whether it's Great Britain or Hungary, there's a problem going on in Hungary. You all ought to watch what's going on in Hungary and Serbia right now. We've got to do something to help the innocent people. And then we got to take action against the bad actors in the world. The guy in the middle.
All right. So I have a question about the refugees. Now, after the Syrian crisis is over and like there's really not any war, which I don't know if there ever will be, how are we going to ensure that all the Syrian refugees that are here are going to go back, or are some of them going to stay here?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So if they do come to the United States and they want to go back, we have to make sure that they have an opportunity to go back to a free and safe society and a country that has some kind of an economic structure that's in place so that they can get jobs and may want to go back. Anytime you leave the home that you've known for your life, and you're forced out, you always want to go back. That's just human nature. So I think that what it's going to take is a lot along the lines of what we did under the Marshall Plan back after World War II, Andy, and go and rebuild the economic structures of those countries and give them a lot of money and pour a lot of money into it so that they can go back into a country where there's roads, sewers, water, a financial system that actually works. Venezuela's falling apart right now because they don't have any cash. Their financial system is falling apart altogether, and that's not too far away. That's in our own hemisphere. Rebuild those basic infrastructures so that they can open a restaurant, they can open a bakery, they can have a company that provides telecommunications. That's what it's going to take for that. For those who want to stay because they have found a life here, we have to figure out a way to make sure that they're welcome and that our fears and biases toward people who don't look like me, who don't speak like me, who don't act like me, are overcome by the fact that we are really all one people. Everybody, in the end, is only seeking happiness. They're seeking freedom, and they're seeking a way of living that while we're here on Earth, that we have the opportunity for the pursuit of happiness, which is essentially what the United States is founded upon. Yeah. You know what? Do you mind if I go? This young woman had a question, so I'm going to jump, and then I'll come back to you, young woman.
Do you think that like Trump will ever like come to his senses in the sense like letting the refugees from Syria come into our country?
Will you, first part of that question?
Yeah. Do you think that Trump will like come to his senses in the sense that he'll like let more refugees into our country from Syria?
Did you notice that Steve Bannon was moved out of the National Security Council these last couple of days? It's in the news. Steve Bannon is the ultra-right nationalist who helped to get Trump elected into office by using his, what they call the alt-right, alternative right, but the ultra-right groups to vote for Trump. But it's my opinion that the when McMaster's, who's the head of the the National Security Agency, I believe it is, or the NSC, one of the two, said, I don't want this political operative in this council anymore because we're deciding on war and peace in the National Security Council. By moving Bannon out, it's seen as a tremendous loss of power in the inner circle in the White House for Steve Bannon. And if Bannon continues to be a liability, they wouldn't have moved him out if Bannon wasn't a liability to the president, right? And the ability of the president to stay in office. And I don't think this president has any assurance of staying in office for the next 4 years. We might see a Nixon-like deal go on, but that's a different, that's a little different conversation. But by moving Bannon out, it demonstrates that they don't have the faith in him anymore on that piece. Now he's going to be fighting inside, and there was a statement today that I saw where Bannon told Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law, who Trump really relies upon on a lot of things, he yelled at Jared Kushner, "You're just a Democrat." Well, now, when Steve Bannon is yelling at Trump's son-in-law, who Trump has probably higher regard than he has for Steve Bannon, Bannon's, I hope, going to get moved out before long, which then will hopefully present a policy from the administration of more tolerance toward all people, Syrian, Mexican, or any other in the United States, which again goes back to my statements to all of you. Get involved. Don't let this kind of stuff, don't let it happen in your classroom. Don't let it happen on your school grounds. Don't let it happen in your neighborhood. Don't let it happen in your community. Don't let it happen in Pierce County. Don't let it happen in Washington. And stand up when it happens on a national basis and say, this is wrong. That's my request of all of you.
Thank you.
That's a good request. Charlie, we got a couple minutes left, so we're gonna probably end it right here. I need to get these guys to help clean up my classroom before they go on vacation here.
Have a great vacation, everybody.
Can we all say
Thank you.
thanks?
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
See you
Thanks, sir.
later.
Appreciate